What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and episode 4 of WandaVision was kind of insane. And here's the funny thing, it looks like there wasn't a whole lot going on there, but there was a lot happening if you knew what to look for. But there are two big questions that are still plaguing me after episode number 4. The first one is, why is Agnes there to help? And the second, how did Wanda learn that she could do all of this? Now, to the first question, the reason we know Agnes is there to help is because we hear her say that in the trailer. Now, I'm taking this at face value in the sense that she is actually there to help, as opposed to the idea that she's saying she's there to help, but she's actually there to cause problems. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that's the case. The second thing is that with episode number 4, this gave us a time frame, and we previously didn't have one. We just kind of assumed that it took place at some point after Avengers Endgame, but we didn't know exactly when. What we're basically told here is that the events of WandaVision seemingly start within 3 weeks of the end of Endgame. And the reason why is because after Endgame ended, everybody got blipped back to life. Monica comes back to life, and then 3 weeks after she returns, she goes and she reports to S.W.O.R.D. Now, at that point, WandaVision, or the beginning of Wanda creating her reality, had already happened. Exactly how long it had happened, I think it was only a few days. And so the result of this is that within about 2.5 weeks, everything with WandaVision popped off after the events of Avengers Endgame. This raises some very important questions with regards to how did Wanda learn she could do this kind of thing? Because by the end of Avengers Endgame, all Wanda was able to do was basically use her telekinesis. There was no indication she could alter reality in any form or fashion. If she could, she would have. And so the question becomes, how did Wanda go from a person who could use telekinesis at the end of Avengers Endgame to 2.5 weeks later being able to create her own little pocket reality on the planet Earth? Now, I think this comes in the form of an answer that seems the most unlikely place. I think she got her hands on the Darkhold. Now, the question is, what's the Darkhold? Okay, the Darkhold is an artifact that's appeared in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's actually from Marvel Comics. Now, in Marvel Comics, the Darkhold is a book that has ties directly to the entity Chthon, this super powerful, evil, demonic entity that wants to possess Wanda Maximoff, right? The prophecy is that he will, and that when he does, he'll basically take over the world. We saw him possess her multiple times. He never took over the world, so prophecy more or less seems to be nonsense. But the overall gist here is that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the difference between the comic book version and the MCU version is that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Darkhold is basically a byproduct of what's called the Hell Dimension, or the Dark Dimension. Now, we can explain the Hell Dimension or Dark Dimension, whatever you want to call it. We can explain it more in depth in terms of its comic book version, because it actually makes a lot more sense when you break it down and you learn the origins of like Mephisto and all those guys. But for our purposes here, the Dark Dimension is a singular dimension out there that is currently ruled over by Dormammu, but we know he's not the only occupant in the Dark Dimension. We know that from The Runaways, which is a Marvel Studios television show that gave us Morgan Le Fay, who came from the Dark Dimension, among other people. And so we know that those individuals who wield the Darkhold have the ability to manipulate the magic of the Dark Dimension. So my thought here is that somehow Wanda managed to get her hands on the book. Now, the most likely explanation is that following the events of Avengers Endgame, Doctor Strange kind of took her under her wing, or at the very least, she traveled with him maybe back to the Sanctum Sanctorum, and she saw some of the stuff that was going on there, and then ultimately managed to find the Darkhold book. Maybe it spoke to her, because we know the Darkhold will draw the attention of people that it feels like it can use to achieve its own ends, i.e. whoever's controlling that book, which is effectively Dormammu, will use those people to achieve his own goals. This is an interesting concept, because one of the things that you saw in episode 4 is that the entire force field that goes around Westview is in the shape of a hexagon. Why does that matter? Because in Doctor Strange, all the books are confined in hexagon patterns when they're held in the library. It was one of the things that has happened to stumble across. I was just watching Doctor Strange looking for clues, and I was like, wait a minute. On top of that, when you have the forces of Kaecilius and his guys basically summoning the power of Dormammu, they're standing in a hexagon. So the idea of the hexagon is a constant theme throughout Doctor Strange. Is it loosely affiliated? Sure. And I don't really know if it hits anything in particular. But assuming that actually happened and that Wanda Maximoff did come into contact with the Darkhold, then it makes perfect sense. The Darkhold is how she's doing all this, because the Darkhold is basically a wishing book. Anybody who opens it up will see blank pages until the book starts talking to them, and then they'll actually see these different spells and incantations written all throughout the book, which grants them anything from the ability to make force fields, to being able to alter reality, to resurrecting the dead. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. And there's no reason to believe that if she got her hands on the Darkhold, she wouldn't be able to do all this. Now, the question becomes, if she did get her hands on the Darkhold, what's the point, right? Why would her having the Darkhold, or why would Dormammu even want her in the first place? Well, this answer comes by way of a couple different things. One of the big theories going on out there is that because Vision is back and alive, that Wanda recreated the Mind Stone, and that's how Vision comes into existence. That's not true. We know that through episode number 4, that Wanda lost her concentration momentarily when she ejected Monica from the WandaVision world. And when Vision walked in, that Vision looked the way he actually looks, right? When he looks dead, he's got that hole in his head. That's how he actually looks. The way that we see him, where he looks like he always did, where he's essentially normal, that's how Wanda makes him look using her powers. But the other thing is that the influence of the dark dimension becomes more and more powerful over the person who's wielding the Darkhold, to the point that it actually starts to corrupt that person to a degree. That becomes a prominent factor when you look at Wanda's reaction after she ejects Monica out of the WandaVision world. She's almost confused and a little bit scared of what she did. It's one of these things where you can kind of go either way. We can look at it in the sense that Wanda is becoming afraid of her own power, or we can look at it as though she's being overtaken by this power that she has, essentially the Darkhold, but she's basically justifying it by saying, well, it's okay because I'm able to maintain my own little world. I can control all of this. And that's the statement that she gives to Vision when she says, it's okay, I have everything under control. She doesn't. She doesn't have everything under control. She's slowly succumbing to the influence and the power of the Darkhold, which in turn is being influenced by Dormammu. Now, to answer this question, why does it matter? Because WandaVision, if you take a step back and you look at it for what it is, it's a prelude, right? It is a prelude to Doctor Strange 2. We've been told that by Kevin Feige. We've been told that by the people who were creating it. We've been told it's a prelude story. Now, if you're somebody like me who's been reading comic books for 25 years, you know what preludes are. That if we look at this for what it is, then we can say, okay, so Wanda got her hands on the Darkhold. The Darkhold is basically exerting its influence over her. She's able to use it for its own ends, but she doesn't really understand the gravity of what she's doing. The Darkhold itself was created or in some way influenced by Dormammu, who wants the Scarlet Witch. And the reason why he wants the Scarlet Witch is because the Scarlet Witch is a means by which Dormammu can effectively influence everything outside of the dark dimension. That's the main goal of him as a villain. We learned that in Doctor Strange 1, that what Dormammu wants to do is essentially take all of his power and influence in the dark dimension and spread it throughout the multiverse and effectively conquer everything. Now, why in turn would this be the motivation of Dormammu as it applies to the Scarlet Witch? Because Dormammu is not just Dormammu in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Dormammu is a combination of Chthon and Mephisto from Marvel Comics, all neatly wrapped up into one individual. And I think that makes perfect sense. The idea of the devil walking around and tricking people into giving up their souls for some measure of temporary power seems far-fetched even for a comic book movie. But having one singular, nigh omnipotent and malevolent being out there that just wants to make people suffer in eternal darkness makes a lot more sense. I don't know, makes more sense to me. But that's my thought on all this, right? Because of what's going on at the end of WandaVision, in effect, the Scarlet Witch is going to basically become the vector by which Dormammu is able to leave the dark dimension and travel throughout the rest of the multiverse, wreaking all kinds of havoc. This is going to lead to Doctor Strange making an appearance at the end of WandaVision, snatching her up and saying, come on, like, we got to go solve this because you're part of the reason why. And ultimately, the whole Multiverse of Madness story is Dormammu's influence reaching throughout the multiverse and him causing all kinds of different problems. They're just fighting a series of small battles in order to win a greater war. We'll probably also end up seeing a whole bunch of other characters. Maybe Mephisto does exist. We're going to see Nightmare, people like that. So we know a lot of those entities will actually exist out there, or they're simply going to manifest as facsimiles of Dormammu. Nightmare is a representation of every single person out there and the nightmares they have, which is a part of Dormammu who just kind of walks around as a singular being. I don't really know. But if you guys are interested in learning more about Mephisto in Marvel Comics, you guys can of course click on the end screen that has Mephisto Explained in Marvel. If you guys are interested in learning more about our various theories and the knowledge that we hold here at Pop Culture Explained about Marvel Comics, then feel free to check out our WandaVision theories and Easter eggs playlist. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.